Welcome to another episode of Dialogues with me, Richard Reeves. I'm very excited for today's episode, which was a wide-ranging conversation with my friend David Brooks, who's the veteran New York Times columnist, Atlantic contributing editor, and a regular on PBS NewsHour, as well as the author of many, many books, most recently The Second Mountain. 21 years ago, David wrote a book about a group he called bobos, the bourgeois bohemians, who combined countercultural tastes and attitudes with traditional economic success, and who he argued became the dominant class in America. And back then, David believed that as elites go, the bobos weren't bad at all. But in his latest essay for The Atlantic, just published, he has some pretty sharp words for them, or I should probably say for us, and the way we've created a hereditary meritocracy by hoarding opportunity for our own kids, how we've fallen down on the job as a leadership class, how we've condescended to the less successful in society, and how we have actively contributed to segregation and inequality. We talk about what class means today, as opposed to, say, tribe, why he now believes that economics is more important than he did even just a few years ago in politics and society. We talk about what he would do if he was advising the Republicans or the Democrats. We talk about some aspects of the culture wars. And we end with a discussion on his new work, which is leading to a new book, on the importance of social recognition, on the importance of being seen by others. So as that brief taste, I think, indicates, it's a pretty broad-ranging conversation, one I hugely enjoyed, and I hope that you do too. David Brooks, welcome to Dialogues.
Great to be with you, Richard.
Well, thanks for coming on. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a long time, and it's very, as it turns out, very timely, because you have a new essay out in The Atlantic on issues that we're both interested in: class, inequality, culture, and politics, and so on. So I want to start with that. It's titled "How the Bobos Broke America." And why that's a particularly good title for those who followed your work is, of course, you are the creator of the bobos. So you're the man who 21 years ago invented the bobo, and now, just as it's coming of age, turning against it. And so this is psychologically fascinating as well. So just for the handful of people who don't know about your book, Bobos in Paradise from 2000, could you briefly define bobos, and then maybe say a little bit about why you've soured somewhat on your own creation?
Yeah, I named them. I didn't create them. I think their parents created them. But, I went to high school in a place called Radnor, Pennsylvania, which is 13 miles west of Philadelphia on the main line. And it had a culture, and it was the culture of the WASP establishment, basically. Katharine Hepburn, that was the culture. And that was a certain leadership class. And so I went to high school there, and it was extremely boring. And people wore duck ties and green pants, and they did what we then called preppy. And then I go to work at the Wall Street Journal, and then I spend 5 years in Europe between 1990 and 1995. And I come back, and there's an Anthropologie, the very first Anthropologie store, and the old WASP establishment would not have named a store after an academic discipline. Mm-hmm. There was a Whole Foods, one of the early Whole Foods. There were a whole bunch of coffee shops celebrating artists on the left bank of Paris. There was a whole new culture. And basically, I was looking at people who had combined 60s values and 90s money. And so the Bobo stands for bourgeois bohemian. And so they were bourgeois. They were suburban shoppers, and you can see them if you go to Palo Alto or Winnetka, Illinois, or many places. But they had this ethos that we're against the establishment. We're anti-establishment. We don't like those rich people. We don't care about money. And so a lot of that book was making fun of their code of financial correctness, which says it's vulgar to spend money on a yacht or a chandelier, but it's super cool to spend money, $20,000 on an Aga stove, because that's a show of your foodie expertise, or a slate shower stall, because slate is sort of earthy. In those days, everything smooth was bad, everything textured was good. So distressed floors, Peruvian fabrics, and so it was a outward commercial display, a consumeristic display, but it was of a new establishment. And basically, the information age rewarded ideas with money. And if you could get into a competitive school, it didn't matter if your father didn't come over, on the Mayflower or Ancestors. You suddenly had access to the new elite, and the meritocracy created another elite. And I wrote in that book in 2000, I mentioned this in the Atlantic piece, I wrote, this is going to be an open elite, because all you have to do is get the right test scores. You don't have to be born in the right families. Yeah. And as you've written, that turned out to be completely wrong. It really helps to be born into the right family, because your mom and dad have passed down certain gifts and certain privileges. They've invested massively in your education. They've given you the right internships, as you've written. And so if you go to 38 top schools, you got more students from the top 1% of earners than the bottom 60% of earners. You got the top 25% of earners take 75% of the places, and the bottom quarter almost none. And so we've created a hereditary meritocracy. And this class has not only controlled our academic routes up to ultimate success, they moved into big cities, jacked up the real estate prices there, and taken over the Democratic Party, as they've taken over left parties all around the Western world. Yeah. And so they've become a hereditary class with lots of power.
And that's the one thing, I mean, you're very honest about this in your Atlantic piece. You actually say, you have this nice, you say it's one of the most naive sentences I've ever written. And the sentence you quote from your previous work is, the educated class is in no danger of becoming a self-contained caste. Anybody with the right degree, job, and cultural competencies can join. Now, actually, maybe that last bit, as I read it again, cultural competencies carried more weight than you could have realized at the time, because, of course, if those cultural competencies and degrees are acquired, then you do end up with this self-contained sort of elite. And so, in some ways, that leads to the next problem with this elite, with this new elite, which is, first of all, they've mastered the meritocracy, right, and then transmitted the merit required for success to their children. So it has become it's more closed than open. But the second thing is, they're kind of jerks about it, in the sense that because they think they're meritocrats, they don't have any of the sense of leadership that would be required towards others, right? And so if you use the phrase noblesse oblige, then immediately you immediately tar yourself with exactly the brush that you're talking about, the kind of person that says that. And I have almost no French, to be clear. But that idea of noblesse oblige is that actually you recognize your own privilege and therefore feel obliged to do more for those who are less privileged. But if you convince yourself you've got there by your own merit, then you don't feel any of that sense of it. And so as you write in the essay, there is actually I'll quote directly from it here. You say, steeped in an outsider, pseudo-rebel ethos, we never accepted the fact that we were a leadership class and therefore never earned the legitimacy and trust that is required to lead. So in some senses, this group never saw themselves as leaders, right? They were anti-establishment. Yeah, so therefore there's a leadership vacuum.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I don't want to romanticize the WASP establishment, but the best of them, I would say George H.W. Bush or John Foster Dulles or the Wise Men, if you remember the Walter Isaacson, Evan Thomas book, which was a guy named John J. McCloy, they really, A, they served in the military, B, they took time off to serve for government service for $1 a year often. And so they had a sense, we are the leadership class, and there are certain obligations. And so they died in much higher numbers in wartime. And frankly, even despite that stupid Titanic movie, they died in higher numbers on the Titanic because they understood it was an obligation. This was an obligation. And so they did have that. And the quality of a society is very influenced by the quality of the leadership class. And so we now have a class of people who say, no, I'm an outsider, I'm against it. I'm against the establishment, I'm against the system. And when you have that kind of ethos, you're not going to take care of the institutions that we need, like a strong media that actually covers the whole country because we have some sort of institutional obligation, or universities that reach out to the whole country because we have an obligation. And, to their credit, the WASPs at Harvard between 1950 and 1960, the President Conant basically self-destroyed the WASP establishment under the supposition we're in a Cold War. We can't have our country run by a bunch of dumb blue bloods who from Kennebunkport. And so they sort of took themselves out of the game without instilling that sense of obligation in the ensuing generations.
Yeah, and I think we should talk a little bit later about how we go from where we are, in a sense, how do you reinstill that? But let's stay for a moment on the sort of crimes of the bobos, of your labeling. Okay, I won't call you their creator. You're right. You were there. You named them rather than creating them. So first of all, we've got they owned, took over, and dominated the meritocracy. So, and they get to define merit. Number two is this issue around failing to act as leaders. You know, they're the worst of all worlds in the sense that they're powerful, but almost denying of their own power and therefore their own institutional responsibility. Another problem is that they've contributed to growing economic inequality and growing segregation. And here you find common cause with Richard Florida, and you actually talk about this in the essay. The creative class is very similar to your bobos. And you both, I think, point out that one of the issues is the degree to which those classes have segregated themselves and therefore entrenched inequality, which I don't think was in your original expectation, that as time's passed. Is that a fair summary of your view, that we've added to that economic inequality?
Yeah, and some of it is just by outcompeting everybody else. Like you have a lot of money. I think there was a Robert Putnam study that found that college-educated parents invest $5,000 per kid per year just in extracurricular activities. Mm-hmm. And that's just an amount of money most people cannot rival. And so it doesn't matter how much money Harvard, Princeton gives away. If they're going to use their current admissions criteria, pretty much you're going to get dominated by people who come from privileged backgrounds. And I teach at Yale, and that's certainly my experience. So that's one thing. The second thing, which I should have seen more, was the assortative mating, that it's almost unheard of to marry outside this class once you're in it. You marry other people with college degrees, usually with a similar college. And I should have seen that because the first part of Bobos in Paradise was a look at what was then the New York Times wedding page. It's changed over the years, but then they called it the mergers and acquisitions page. It was Goldman Sachs marries McKinsey, summa cum laude marries magna cum laude. And so it was a purely unabashedly elitist marriaging of these two. And when you get two Harvard law grads marrying each other, they're often a different echelon. So that's another piece. Then there's the piece you wrote about in Dream Hoarders, which was actual things that they did that actively discriminate, actively hold people down. And you wrote about the internships, you wrote about housing regulations and that sort of stuff. And I didn't imagine we would do that quite to the same degree. And then there's the other thing, SAT preps, there's a whole series of other things. And then finally, geography is just super important. This is Raj Chetty's work. And if you're in a neighborhood, frankly, like Radnor, Pennsylvania, where I went to, you're surrounded by people with the same values. And I went to a public high school, which looked sort of like the Breakfast Club, sort of normal upper-middle-class suburban high school, class of 365, and this is back in the 80s. I think we sent 60 kids to Ivy League or similar schools and that's public high school. So you just had this incredible concentration of people who were very education focused. And that was the normal pathway. I don't think I knew anybody who didn't go to college. It was just like a given. Like you wake up in the morning, you turn 19, you go to college. And so these are all subtle things that really segregate society.
That's even more true today. I think what we've seen is a slight decline in racial segregation in our cities, but an increase in economic segregation. You're right. We've talked about Florida. You've talked about Putnam. Sean Reardon's work, I think, shows this quite clearly too. And so your neighbor is somewhat more likely, if you're living in an upper middle class neighborhood, a bobo neighborhood, your neighbor is somewhat more likely to be of a different race, but is significantly less likely to be of a different class. Right. So if you're white in that neighborhood, in fact, that's true for me. Right. You have a black neighbor, but they're a lawyer with a law degree from Yale, right? So there's less class mixing than there was.
Yeah, Richard Florida's done some very good work on occupational segregation. And he finds the most occupationally segregated cities are places like San Jose and San Francisco, where people really have very similar jobs and they all live with each other.
Yeah, so that then creates this bubble, I think, which means that you are surrounded by those of a similar culture, and it means you're surprised by those outside of you. So, and I will come in a moment to the extent to which we split as a tribe. But I think the last thing, you've already alluded to this, the last problem with the bobos that I think it's worth addressing is political capture. So we've talked about they own the meritocracy. We've talked about their role in economic inequality, segregation. We've talked about their lack of institutional responsibility. I think the last thing is this: they capture the parties, particularly of the left.
Right.
And then they drag those parties towards more cultural left issues than economic left issues. And you talk quite a bit about that. Why do you think that that's a problem in and of itself? I think it's just empirically true, but why does it matter the parties of the left have become so bobo, to use that phrase, that term?
Yeah, well, one problem with it is, well, one thing is just interesting that, the Tory party in England was the landed gentry party. And it's completely flipped its class structure under Boris Johnson. And that's just remarkable. The Republican Party was the country club party. And now it's largely, not entirely, but largely a working class party. And so that's just interesting that would happen. I do think it has the older Democratic Party, which frankly Joe Biden belongs to, was a party that really had its heart and soul in the working class. And Joe Biden's Scranton background is part of that. And so condescension was alien to its nature because it really saw the workers as really the meat and potatoes of our country. You would not say condescension is alien to the modern progressive movement. I mean, there's right-wing snobbery too, believe me. But I do think the reason so many people voted for Trump is they feel looked down upon by this class. If the creative class or bobos, whatever we're going to call them, they control what our friend Jonathan Rauch calls the regime, like who gets to decide what's true. And so if you're going to rebel against the class, they reject truth and expertise. They control, really media. And so if you feel unseen, it's because this class doesn't see you. Mm-hmm. And then if you feel looked down upon, it's probably because this class looks down upon you. And one of the things I really enjoyed researching the article was reading this book called Privilege, which was set, I think, in St. Paul's or St. George's School, one of the elite
St. Paul's
elite schools. And the author, whose name I'm now blanking on, has this concept of ease. He taught it.
Oh yeah, this is Seamus Rahman Khan, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he went to this school, and then he taught there, and now he's a sociologist. And he says what you learn there is partly, whatever is taught of the subjects, but it's really a manner, and the manner is knowing how to treat your professors. And my Yale students are excellent at this, with the right amount of deference, but also the right amount of chumminess. And so they become extremely effective mentor magnets because they know how to do this. They know they can walk into any room and basically master whatever they find there. And then toward the cafeteria workers, it's this mixture of friendliness that pretends to ignore class distinctions, but secretly reinforces them. And this is a manner of ease which we recognize in each other. And if somebody doesn't have this ease or has this insecurity about the world that's really been created, walking into I got in a lot of trouble years ago because I took somebody into a deli that sold sopressata and all this Italian sort of peasanty stuff. And this person hadn't been to college, was young, and sort of did not want to be there. And to us, walking into a Whole Foods is not a culturally complicated thing to do. But if you've never been in this kind of environs, and I've encountered this over and over again, it can be culturally kind of intimidating.
Yeah, it's interesting. This idea of ease, I think, is very interesting partly because you think of the antonym, which is to have dis-ease and not be at ease. And there is a slight tension here, I think, because on the one hand, I mean, first of all, I recognize it hugely, and I recognize it with some pain in myself, honestly. And it is this ability to interact appropriately across this vast range, right? So I am one of those people who, actually not because of a privileged background, but I did end up going to Oxford, where you do pick some of this up, where you can hang out with billionaires and lords, and then the next day with someone who's working in your yard or someone who's serving you food, and there's a sort of egalitarian ethos to that. It's sort of anti-snob. To be a snob in your interpersonal relations would be a real downer now, right? If you were seen in any way to be looking down on the person in the cafeteria by your colleagues at the New York Times or at Brookings or something, that would be really bad, right? But at the same time, there is a snobbery. So how do you think about that? Because on the one hand, the ease is anti-snobbery of any kind, right? You can't be a snob to have ease. You have to just be perfectly relaxed. But there is, I also think you're right, a snobbery at a class level. So maybe that's the difference, right? There is still, we simultaneously look down our nose at people, but then we also, when we meet them, treat them with respect, or apparently.
Yeah. With superficial respect, I would say, but okay. Exclusion. So, an open floor plan or open manners, or it used to be to prove you're high class. And I would love to get to Pierre Bourdieu in a minute, but you would say in his day, he's a French sociologist in the 60s and 50s. You listen to Chopin, or say, you listen to high culture. And that's no longer a status marker anymore. Anybody can listen to high culture and go to the symphony. So being an omnivore and having a wide diversity and eclectic set of cultural tastes is a sign, and that takes a lot of expertise, a lot of time, a lot of subtle one-upmanship to know which indie band is slightly cooler than what other band. And Taylor Swift is completely aware that indie bands are cooler than her. She sings about this. And so these are the subtle gradations that you have to be in a certain culture to understand. And some of them are even more so. It's like, sort of, if you're in a certain culture, you understand you don't quote Santayana's those who are condemned, or who don't know history are condemned to repeat it, because it's too banal. Everyone knows that one. So there are certain quotations you're not supposed to do. It's considered you really haven't been around. And so there are all sorts of subtle gradations to show membership in a club. This is what humans do. And in your old country, it was by accent. I wonder if it's by accent. I think it's a little less by accent here and more by word choice and things like that.
I think that's right. It's hard. It's a little bit harder. There is an accent thing, but I think you write about this idea of no brow as opposed to either low brow or high brow. And so let's talk a bit about Bourdieu and this idea of cultural capital, because I think what you're saying is that the kind of cultural capital you need now is no brow. It is this ability to effortlessly move across in a very knowing way between different kinds of cultural form. And it's not enough to just understand what's happening at the ballet, but you also have to understand what's happening at Bonnaroo or Lollapalooza or something like that. Is that why you're referring to Bourdieu? Because we have to update our definition of cultural capital?
Yeah, well, I think partly. First, he was a great advance over Karl Marx, who saw class as strictly an economic thing, and Bourdieu says it's cultural capital. What culture do you know? Linguistic capital. How do you talk? Symbolic capital, what degrees do you have? And he had this whole range of much more sort of emotional, moral, and intellectual forms of capital, and he showed how those can all be exploited. And I would say now it's knowing, it used to be you knew what wine was great, but now like I have a restaurant I used to go to before COVID, they would tell you which farm every product came from. And I used to want to ask the waiter that the soil that my carrot was grown in, was it happy soil? Was it sad soil? I want to know. I'm organically rooted in my local farm to table thingy. And so that's part of the ethos.
They probably should bring a sample of the soil to the table.
Yeah.
That's the next step will be to have a little pot, if you'd like to sort of stick your finger in the soil that your carrot was grown in. But I'm glad you mentioned the column that you got into trouble for when the internet crashed on you, because you've almost certainly forgotten that column was ostensibly about my book, Dream Hoarders.
Oh, that's right. Yes. And you got a lot of publicity out of it. I don't know if it helped.
Well, except that nobody remembers that it was about. So that actually, a lot of people will say, "Do you remember that David Brooks thing where he got into the whole the Pomodoro column?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do remember it. Actually, it was about my book." And they go, "Oh, really? I didn't know that." So it was absolutely zero use to me because this thing crashed. But in that column, the pivot was around the kind of sandwich issue that the internet crashed over you over, was really you sort of outlined the economic issues that I talked about, or if you like the material issues like zoning, and to some extent higher education, and then you pivoted towards some of these more cultural barriers, and you said. I've actually got it here. You said, I've come to think the structural barriers, he emphasizes that's me, are less important than the informal social barriers that segregate the lower 80%. And we've talked a lot about that already in this conversation. But I'm wondering if you've become a little bit more economics oriented than you were. And I think that partly because you're writing a lot right now about Biden's economic approach. You have a new column out today, and you've actually suggested in one of your recent columns that by narrowing the income gaps, Biden's agenda would help to reduce some of the kind of class animosity. So I'm just wondering where you are now in that. It's a very simplistic way of thinking about this is culture versus economics as the drivers of our divide. And I feel like you've moved a little bit towards more of an economic understanding of inequality than a cultural one. Is that a fair reading?
Yeah, I think that is a fair reading. Do you have what year that column was? It was probably within the last 4 or 5 years. Well, it would have been when Dream
2016, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I do think that's a first side note. The one time if you want the internet to really go after you in a very nasty way, tell a story against yourself where you're the villain. And that, because I was trying to say, look, I'm part of the problem here. And I'm vulnerable. And everyone jumped on you like, yeah, I know. I wrote that. I'm part of the problem here. But anyway, but vulnerability has this weird triggering effect on a lot of people. And secondly, I do think you're right. I think somehow, partly, if say it was 2016, I sort of missed the Trump rise. And at that time, I was working at the New York Times. I was teaching at Yale. And so and I'm living in Washington. So I'm on the Acela. Mm-hmm. And so if you're in that milieu, you see the cultural barriers, especially. But after that, I spent 4 years traveling to 3 states a week and going to 35, 40 states every year and interviewing hundreds of people, mostly Trump supporters. And I think I became more attuned than what I saw in the economic charts became more visible when I physically witnessed it over and over again and talked to the people who were its victims, that the economic gaps are part of the problem. They're not all the problem, but they're much larger. And government, I'm not sure government can reduce cultural inequality, but government can certainly reduce economic inequality. And I think the fragmentation of society in large parts of the areas left behind by the bobo ascendancy can be ameliorated by the Biden economic plan. And, I worry about it with inflation the way it is. I worry it's too big. But when I look at if I look at the economic data, I worry about it. If I look at the sociological data, I support it. Because I think we have to do something big and significant to try to reverse the left behindness and the social fragmentation of, J.D. Vance world.
Well, I guess it also depends how big you think the stakes are. I mean, if you think the continuation of the sorts of divides we're seeing now could potentially threaten our liberal democracy, of capitalism, then it's worth risking a fair amount of inflation, frankly, to overcome that.
Right, I agree. And the Biden bills, especially the infrastructure bill, is massive redistribution to people without college degrees. Exactly the sort of people who need the redistribution, and presumably would give them, which is another thing that needs to happen, more avenues up the income ladder. And so it would widen. You going to a 4-year college would not be so the overwhelming definition of how you make it in America today.
Yeah, and I actually want to turn to that in a moment, but I want to talk about the use of class as a category, because one of the things that's interesting about your piece in The Atlantic is you talk about the bobos, but then you situate the bobos within this. Basically, it's a dual hierarchy. It's like a sort of DNA thing where you got two helix. You have, and the first distinction you make is between blue and red, and then you just find the blue hierarchy starting with the blue oligarchs, the kind of tech people, and then the bobos, and then the young people who are woke, and then the caring class who are people woke, and then you do the same on the right with the gentry and so on. So it's interesting because you make this political divide, and then within that you have these ladders which are broadly economically defined, I would say, but then with lots of culture as well. And so it's actually quite difficult, I think, to figure out now where you think the weight is between politics as a definer, economics, which we just talked about, and culture. And I guess more importantly, the kind of overlap between them. Essentially, you did still make that red-blue divide. Right. And I think that's right, actually. I think politics is becoming more of a leader in this identity stuff than a follower. But I was interested that was your decision. Why did you decide to construct the taxonomy that way?
It just struck me that we've so polarized as a society. The GOP gentry, who's someone who owns like 10 McDonald's franchises in Waukesha, he's not even in the same economic structure as the finance guy or the head of the Ford Foundation. Those are like two different kinds of economies. And so it just seemed we've polarized in these two groups, and within each group there's rivalry. And economics and pure income levels makes a big difference, but even age makes a big difference. I mean, The difference between, I'll start in D.C., the people who live in Cleveland Park, which is a upper middle class boomer area, versus the people who meet in Shaw, which is a younger hipster area, if you look at their educational credentials, look pretty similar. But the hipsters hate the boomers because for a whole series of reasons, some of them good, some of them bad, partly because the boomers were hypocrites. We were for equality, and then we created inequality. But partly just because economic circumstances are so different. If you're 30, your economic prospects are not what a boomer faced when they were 30. You've got high education costs, high housing costs, and your chances are just much worse. And so there's legitimate anger about that. And so they're educationally pretty similar, but generationally different, and that impacts class consciousness. And I treat class as partly as an economic category, but really as a consciousness category. And one of the things that was interesting to me is, in Britain, people are very comfortable talking about class. When I researched this piece, the European writers were more sophisticated than the American writers, were just less practiced at it. And I thought, the normal human American reaction is, I hate talk of class. But now everyone is sort of clued in, yes, we're a class society. I think that old myth that America is not a class society is dead as a doornail.
I agree. It's actually one of the things that I wrote about was this. I think I ended up saying that I missed the class consciousness of the UK, that I hate it. I used to hate it, how obsessed everyone was with class and with figuring out by which fork you used and how you sounded and which school you'd been to, which class you were in. It's exhausting, honestly. But I ended up preferring that to the sort of ersatz classlessness of the US, where you've got this ruthlessly effective class reproduction machine, but camouflaged under this meritocracy. And everybody wears baseball caps and pretends to be the same. And you're like, no, you're not. At least in the UK, I actually wrote this in the Times, I think, at least in the UK, posh people have the decency to feel guilty some of the time. Whereas here, it's like you can be guilt-free posh, which was... So I agree that there's this new... And of course, race is a big part, and you mentioned this too, but because race is such a salient category in the US, I think that's a kind of good reason why class has been less important. But I think a bad reason has been because of the myth of meritocracy, as you talk about it. But I was very interested. I think you're right still to highlight the political distinctions. And in some ways... I want to ask you what you think about how far politics is now a leading indicator, the cause of other indicators rather than the other way around. I think we're used to seeing the variables going from education or income or geography, and what does that mean in terms of how you'll vote, or religion. But I'm increasingly convinced by the evidence that some of it goes the other way. And there's some evidence, for example, even in kind of religion. I'm trying to remember now. I think I tried to make a note of the work that's been done on this, showing that people who are Michelle Margolis shows that people who are Republican are more likely to become churchgoers.
Yeah,
right. So you become Republican, and it does run that way. It is she can track people over time. And actually, my wife had a personal experience the other day that I think underlined this, which was, let's say in a state somewhere in the South, this guy is trying to use a boat ramp that he didn't have access to, with this beautiful boat towed behind a very expensive truck. And my wife said to him, look, you can't. This is private property. You can't use this boat ramp. It was a boat ramp that's shared with some neighbors. And he lost his temper. But almost the first thing he said was, I can tell just by looking at you how you voted. And you're the reason that this country is going to shit. And, wow. And she was like, first of all, well, how did he know that? And immediately you're like wondering. but second of all, it's like, I don't think you necessarily would have immediately gone to politics as the attack, right? You might have gone to class or something. But people go to politics much more quickly now. And so do you think it's become more of an identifier in and of itself from which other things flow rather than the other way around? Yeah,
I think so. I think Jesus only goes to Republican households now. He goes through the voter rolls and he figures out that. I think, and this would be my explanation for it. If you're, say, a member of the working class, white working class, high school educated, and you see this class rising, and you don't have a word for it, but you know that those coastal people, they're doing pretty well, and they've got a lot of advantages. You really can't compete with them on culture because all the cultural institutions are one thing. You can't compete with them on educational system because all the teachers are, in this class. And, of course, there's diversity within class, et cetera. But how can you compete with them? Your arena where you can really beat them is politics because there aren't that many creative class people. It's like 20% of the country, as you would say. Mm. And so suddenly you have a realm where you can exercise some power and also try to preserve the vision of the country that you think is the right vision, which is sort of a non-snobby vision, a religious vision. I mean, all the things that go with Trumpianism. And so politics has become the battleground. And I think I wrote in the piece, in the 2000 or in the 1990s when I wrote Bobos, I could go into restoration hardware, and it was your consumer expressions that was the crucial signifier. Mm-hmm. And that's still a signifier, but now it's really your political attitudes. It's whether you use the word problematize or systemic racism or things. These are now signaled. They're not only real expressions of real things, they're also signals of a certain level of membership in a certain class or not a certain class.
Yeah, it feels almost as if we've gone from a certain kind of conspicuous consumption, and then that was changed as a result of Bobos, but quite inconspicuous politics, to quite, I mean, you actually quote, I think, Elizabeth Holkett's Sum of Small Things, to actually inconspicuous consumption. And she has this great story of people cutting the price tags out of their dresses so that their housekeepers couldn't see how much money they were spending because they were so embarrassed by it. But quite conspicuous politics. Right. And so you can go, back to your point about being quite careful about how you show your wealth through consumption, but you do show your politics through your yard signs, through the flags that you raise. It's actually quite striking how many signs are still up, actually. I think someone could do a study sort of saying that actually the time elapsed after an election finishes, that signs are still up, is a mark of the dysfunction of a society, because there are a lot of signs still up. And so I think both on left and right, that's become quite an important marker. And that leads me to wonder whether it's useful to think about class at all. I think you made a good defense of how it still has some value. But it's almost more like tribes. When I looked at your taxonomy, you've got politics, it's almost as if you have like the tribe of people in Greenwich, Connecticut voting for Trump, and the tribe of people in Northeast Tennessee voting for Trump. They are different tribes, right. But they form an alliance of one kind or another, right? So the blue bloods support Trump because he'll keep their taxes low, and populist regatta, to use your term, vote for Trump because it's a cultural expression. And they sort of just very, very, it may be an uneasy alliance, but they form an alliance. And then there are other tribes around the place. So I almost think that this kind of tribal way of thinking of it as tribes is almost more useful in thinking of it in terms of classes now.
I think that's changing a little. Like, I happen to have done research into Greenwich, and so Greenwich went for Biden 2-1. And it used to be, until very recently, that most rich places were Republican, and most rich people were Republican. Then it became true that most rich places were Democratic, and then most rich people, the individuals, were still Republican, the top 1%, top 5%. And the reason those rich places like Greenwich were blue was because they got a lot of teachers, professors, other professionals who were more likely. But now it's if you take the top 5%, they're more Democratic than Republican. And so I do think there's an economic element that slowly, not entirely, there's different kinds of rich people, but income has become a pretty terrible predictor of how you're going to vote. I quote a Piketty study on this, but education levels have become quite a good predictor.
Yes, I think that's right. I guess I was probably thinking of the Greenwich. I may be getting my geography wrong. A Greenwich Republican Party who went for Trump as opposed to Jeb Bush. I'm trying to channel Evan Osnos at this point, and I'm worried I've got the wrong place.
Yeah. But I read his piece for this piece. Yeah.
There's like a country club Republic, and it's very interesting how even these sort of very, very blue blood, right, old stuff that you were referring to earlier, most of those Republican parties at a local level did go for Trump, and then again.
Yeah, and this is something else I've noticed, and this is how tribalism works. So I go to these events. I cover events where politicians go, and I cover events where Republican politicians go. And where Republicans politicians go is where Republican donors are. And so I go to conferences where there are a ton of Republican donors, the big donor class. And in 2015, they were all anti-Trump. They wanted Bush or Rubio, whoever. 2016, they voted for him because they didn't like Hillary. By 2020, they were enthusiastically pro-Trump. And I was at a table with a bunch of donors, and somebody asked, let's say we could bring Mitt Romney back to run against Trump in 2024. Who would you support? Trump. And so I think that's a fact that, the people who hate me hate him, and he's the leader of my team. And that I think that's just tribal psychology kicking everybody into loyalty to the head man. And so that part, I think, is tribal.
And do you think that will now change? I wanted to ask you what your sort of political read is now on the Republican side. We can come back to the Democrats maybe, but where do you think this is going to play out on the Republican side? Because you're right. Once it's in place, that tribal instinct is quite hard to get out. All right, so you have to do some sort of exorcism. It feels like of the Republican Party to get rid of
right.
Trump. But where do you think Republicans will go? And put differently, where would you be advising them to go should they turn to you for counsel?
Yeah, I would just say be against the creative class. There's always going to be a market for that. You don't have to have a policy agenda. You don't have to do anything. Just be against those people. And you can call them the media or whatever you want to call them. You're against those people, whether you're in the UK or Italy or Canada even. We've shown there's a market for that. Hungary, famously, these days. Yeah. And so that would be my political advice. And they're pretty good at exploiting that. I think the CRT is partly, this opposition to critical race theory is partly a racial, not even a dog whistle, just a whistle. But it's also a bit, those people are taking over our schools. They've got these big, long words, problematize intersectionality. And that's sort of, it's not only a racial menace, it's a class menace. And so they know how to pick the symbols of that'll get this cultural animosity going.
Yeah, actually, there's this blogger, Slate Star Codex.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wrote. He had a piece advising the Republican Party along these lines. Actually, he said I think it was called something like "Talk About Class," but what he really was, it was entirely negative. It was entirely just launch an assault against the Ivy League, against the media, etc., and galvanize all of this. And it does seem that could be quite effective. And I also wonder whether or not, Biden is obviously, as you say in the piece, trying to sort of stay out of some of these cultural issues and just deliver on some bread and butter economic issues. But you do wonder whether the rising crime, for example, and the growing problems on the southern border and immigration could actually, combined with the anti-political correctness, critical race theory, create quite a powerful political cocktail for Republicans if they know what to do with it in the midterms.
First, I should say I've been slagging off on the bobos a lot, but the people who reacted against the new class hierarchy for understandable reasons, but they reacted in the most despicable possible way. In a way that denies truth, that plays, that manifests in a racial animosity. So I don't want to seem to be suddenly defending the Trump movement as some sort of righteous response to elitism. It's a despicable response to elitism.
Right.
But as for the future Republican Party, I look at the issue mix that's out there. We already saw in the New York primary race. Crime, immigration, and the sense that somebody's taking over the schools. Those are three powerful voting issues. And those are issues that I imagine the Republican Party is going to run on in the foreseeable future.
Yes. And as you say, Biden's done a pretty good job so far of keeping himself, distant from that and just delivering on it. And so that leads me to think about where now for the parties of the left, because I think you rightly identified I agree with the Bobo takeover. In fact, arguably having worked for Blair, and so on, I was part of that. And there's this, you probably know this joke, but there's a great joke about the Miliband brothers. Obviously, Ed Miliband became the leader of the Labour Party when beating his own brother, as you know. It should probably have been David, but David was Blair's foreign secretary and ran the Number 10 policy unit, and I worked with both of them. But their father, Ralph Miliband, was a famous Marxist intellectual. And so the joke about the Milibands was always that Ralph Miliband always said the Labour Party would betray the working class. And his sons have done everything in their power to make that come true. And it's like many good jokes, it works because it had just enough truth in it. So I think you're right about what happened to the parties of the left. Biden's tacking back as far as one can tell towards more of that economic bread and butter issue, but largely by avoiding the culture war issues rather than confronting them. And I'm just wondering now to put your other hat on, advise the Democrats, like how do they face that Republican threat? But also, can Biden continue to do that? Because the culture war issues are not going away just because he's ignoring them.
Yeah, I think he's absolutely right to do them. Most of the culture war issues have nothing to do with the federal government. It's Confederate statues or, CRT. It's like you can be president and really not have a position about this. And to the extent that he could divorce government from culture war, then I think that's absolutely the smartest thing the Democrats could do, because they still have an agenda that actually does help the people who are hurting. And if I were them, and I think Biden is way ahead of me on this, I would go back to Hubert Humphrey liberalism. go back to the pre-culture war kind of liberalism that existed from FDR up until 1968. And to me, that's sort of the world he grew up in, and that's the politics he's pursuing. And I think it's the best possible strategy. And I have to say, we're talking in a week when, well, in a period when the moderates in the party regulars, let's not call them moderates, but the regular party, have won 5 elections against the progressives. So I think what's happening is that people are seeing the downside of letting your party get taken over by people who speak to each other in Brooklynese, but don't necessarily speak to the party. And I think the Democrats are not behaving the way the Republicans are. They're holding their center in the way the Republicans are not holding their center. And so I think they understand the problem. I actually gave a talk on this essay to a bunch of Democratic senators recently. I wouldn't say they were totally fired up by it, but I said, your problem is you get seen as this party, as the party of Shaw and Cleveland Park, or if we're going to talk in New York terms, Soho and Williamsburg. A lot of people don't necessarily think the way I do in sociological gradations, but I think those sociological gradations are awfully powerful in driving how people identify themselves, and once they have their personal identity, how they then vote.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the trick is to not take the bait. I think that part of the story of recent politics in the US has been for the bait to go in the water and then the left to take it. So it could be, I don't know, bathrooms, or gender, or something else. And I think what's happening is that, of course, there'll be people on the left who will always be out there on defund the police or transgender bathrooms and so on. But by and large, the Biden people are just letting the bait float by them and not biting it. And that's actually must be driving the right crazy, because what they're very good at is kind of baiting Democrats into a response. Right. And sometimes the hardest thing to do is not say anything. But
yeah, I mean, if you're a Democratic politician, you want the right going after Ibram Kendi, not Joe Biden.
Yes.
And so, that I think the culture wars have to be fought, but they don't have to be fought in politics. And we're going to argue about the history of American racism, but that doesn't have to be Joe Biden's job. And so that could be Ibram Kendi's job. And I think we can have those cultural disputes, but it doesn't have to be the Democratic Party's mission, the way it has become the Republican Party's mission to have those disputes.
Yes, and then I agree, and then see how the chips fall, if you like.
Was really drawn to the essay because of how international it is, that there's a Trump in almost every country. There's a Macron, sort of elite technocrat figure in almost every country. There's a Bernie Sanders in almost every country. And so we in America think our politics are so unusual. But it looks pretty normal for Western Europe and the U.S. or the Commonwealth or wherever. This is a global phenomenon, not a U.S. phenomenon.
Yes, I think that's a good point that's well made, because it points to looking for the shared factors rather than the ones that are different between us. Like, what's different about America is, well, actually not very much. It's just that it was expressed differently. And obviously, I thought quite a lot. I'm just back from the UK, and so that kind of issue of how Brexit has played out and so on. One of the interesting things about the UK, of course, is the way that the posh people in the UK are able to just sort of play it in lots of different ways. Boris Johnson as the old Etonian, able to sort of do a Disraeli on the British working class, basically, because of Brexit. It's just, and people just don't care.
We have that. I mean, Josh Hawley is Ivy Leaguer. Ted Cruz went to Princeton. J.D. Vance went to Yale. I mean, Donald Trump went to Penn. You can't be a populist unless you went to an Ivy League school. So.
Yes, I think that's another of your very good lines. But I wanted to just spend a little bit of time, if possible, talking about what your next big project is. Obviously, you're writing these regular long essays to The Atlantic, and we'll link to all of those, as well as your Times column, and you have a column out about the moderates. But what about book-length work or bigger intellectual projects? I sense that some of the work you're doing here is a sort of prelude, maybe, to what's coming next.
A little. When I was spending those 4 or 5 years really interviewing people, I kept hearing people say, "I feel invisible, I feel unseen and unheard." And this was black people not feeling their daily experience was seen by whites, Republicans and Democrats looking at each other in blind incomprehension, teenage kids who had no one saw them, people trapped in bad marriages. So it occurred to me a very crucial skill for any family, organization, or nation is the ability to see others deeply and be deeply seen. And so I want to know, what is that skill? What is the skill of really getting to know someone, knowing how they tick, and then making them feel felt? And actors have a piece of this skill when they get into character. Psychologists when they're trying to counsel people. Teachers. I have a friend whose daughter was struggling in second grade, and the teacher said, "You're really good at thinking before you speak." And that made the girl who thought she was awkward feel, "Oh, yeah, I'm valued. She sees me." And it turned around her whole year. I had a teacher in 11th grade. I said something smart-alecky, and she said, "David, you're being glib. Stop it." And on the one hand, I felt humiliated but on the other hand, I felt honored that she told the truth about me. Mm-hmm. And so I felt weirdly, sometimes when you're seen accurately, it's not always pleasant. My book, I write about, there's a scene in Good Will Hunting. The Robin Williams character is talking to the Matt Damon character, and he's a shrink talking to a patient. And he says to him, "When I look at you, I don't see a self-confident man. I see a scared shitless kid." And then he goes on about all the ways he's substituting book knowledge for real knowledge. And the Matt Damon character, Will Hunting, absolutely knows he's been nailed. And not only has he been nailed, that Robin Williams' character has listened to him so well, he's heard the thing the Matt Damon character has tried desperately not to reveal. And he tells him, "I still love you despite it." And that's a very high order of hearing, when you hear exactly what the other person is ashamed of, and you say, "It's okay." And that's partly the psychodynamic in their relationship.
It's super interesting, and I think it does link a bit to some of what we were talking about a moment ago. And one of the ways you conclude your essay is by talking about the moral ecology. And so you have this lovely line where you say, we want to changing this sorting mechanism, which is really a reference to the meritocracy we talked about before, requires transforming our whole moral ecology such that possession of a Stanford degree is no longer seen as signifying a higher level of being. And so I do think there's obviously a link there between this narrow definition of meritocracy, and you refer to some work there. I was thinking a bit about Michael Young's original book on meritocracy, where actually, there's this guy who's a rose gardener, and he's, industrial worker, but he creates the most beautiful rose garden, I think, in the country. And the question is, who cares? The question that's asked in the book is, who cares about his rose garden, right? Who sees that other bit of work? So I do think there's a link between your criticism of meritocracy and wanting to broaden out the ways that we see people. But it's important, I think, what you've just said, because what you're saying is, I see you well enough and I respect you enough to be honest with you.
Right.
And I'm wondering whether some of what you were saying earlier about this ease and so on is not to do that. It's very difficult, right? And maybe especially difficult now, right? I mean, this could be one of the downsides of our kind of growing concerns about racial equality in general, is do you say as bluntly as that? Would you say that now? Would you say it to a black student, for example? Here's what's wrong with you. Or would you be inhibited? How do you create enough of a respectful relationship in order to be honest with each other, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, unconditional regard. I mean, if you have to establish a relationship before you can do that. And I think one thing to start with is with the idea that we have a distinction between reason and emotion, between knowing as studying versus knowing the way the Bible thinks about knowing, which can mean everything from studying to having sex with to entering into covenant. It's an emotional knowledge. They did not distinguish between the heart and the mind and the brain, and that's more accurate cognitively. And so a lot of the quality of your encounters will depend on the quality of attention you cast on somebody. Is it a quality of attention that's respectful, that's generous? I don't care if you're religious or not, but I do think the phrase "made in the image of God" is a very useful concept. If you treat every other human being as if they were made in the image of God, you're going to show them a reverence and respect, and you're going to be curious about them, and so you'll be empathetic toward them. But one thing I've learned in the research is empathy is great, but it's pretty limited. If you think, I can take the perspective, I can imagine what's going on in their head, the odds are you're very wrong. Mm-hmm. There's a scientist at Texas who measures how accurately people are reading each other in conversation. And the average is we get it right like 22% of the time. What are you thinking at this second? There are a few superstars who get it right 50% of the time, and there's a lot of disasters who get it right 0% of the time. But you can train yourself to be better, and the book is really about how you would train it. But one of it is knowing how to have good conversations, or knowing how to have good ask the right questions. If you want to get to know somebody else's mind, you have to ask them because they're the only ones who can. You can't guess. You need to tell them, and you need to structure conversations with the right kind of questions. And so, some of the questions are just to gently warm into it. Is I ask people, "Where'd you get your name?" And that often leads to a conversation about family of origin or some favorite relative. It's a way to enter into the gradual gradations of getting to know someone. Another question that a friend of mine asked in a job interview is, what would you do if you weren't afraid? We're all afraid of something, but we don't quite know what it is. And so he asked this. He was being interviewed for a job. He asked this of the interviewer, and at the end, and she burst out crying because if she wasn't afraid, she wouldn't be doing HR at that company. And I've taken to asking that of my Yale students. And about 10% say if I wasn't afraid, I'd leave Yale. It's not the right school for me, but I can't give up the prestige because I'm afraid. And so there are all sorts of questions. How do the dead show up in your life? What ancestral influence is on your life? Like, I have a Jewish background. The history of Judaism inculcates a certain attitude toward books, a certain attitude toward argument that stretches back for centuries. And every cultural group has these century-long influences that shape who we each are. And so the different questions are really not probing. They're joint explorations to what's tacit within each of our minds.
And they're good. I like the gentleness of them too, rather because they're not confrontational. A friend of mine once gave me some advice. Say when you're interviewing, you should ask people, what was it that was broken in your own childhood that you're trying to heal with your choice of occupation? And honestly, it sometimes worked.
Right.
It sometimes worked. It didn't really work very well when you were hiring childcare workers for your children. But I think it's this idea of knowledge. And I'm thinking about the fact that, particularly in kind of biblical language, but I guess in the more ancient language, knowing was used for having sex with someone, right? To know someone. And so there was and I think what's important, there's an implied intimacy in that. What it really meant to really know someone, right? Is to be that close to them. And I also agree with your point about, the theological construct of individual identity. So I'm hearing you and thinking about Philip Pettit's line that a truly equal society is one where you look each other fully in the eye. Right. And I think all of your work before about looking down on and deplorables. And so if you think about how often we use eye contact in these discussions, right? Look me in the eye and say that. Look down on someone. Or even the way in which in deference you're supposed to look down. You're supposed to bow in the most extreme circumstances. But actually, Mamie Till's last comment to Emmett Till before he went to Mississippi, almost the last thing she said to him was, don't look the white folks in the eye. Right. Because, of course, to look someone straight in the eye is an assertion of moral equality, which you can be punished for if you're not seen as equal. This point about the theology is super interesting to me because I discovered, to my delight, that Jefferson didn't write, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. What Jefferson actually wrote was, we hold these truths to be sacred and inalienable. And then it was edited later, but that sounds a bit too godlike. So it was edited to self-evident. But Jefferson's original formulation was, oh, it's used to be sacred. And that's a gentle way of saying, I think that maybe liberal societies of all kinds in particular require a level of mutual respect. And maybe that respect has to be grounded on something other than a self-evident human rights-based secular truth. Where that leads you, I don't know. So are you reading a lot of Charles Taylor and Hegel and people like that as well?
A little bit. I'm reading a lot of neuroscience. I'm reading a lot of psychologists, talking to a lot of actors. One actor I spoke to, I asked, how do you get in the role? And he said, I find the one overlap between the character and me, and then I build out. So he said, some people they put their hands in their front pockets. And when you do that, you hunch over your shoulders. You're sort of inward and turning inward. And so once I get in that posture, I'm beginning to get into that character. And so, biographers, if you're writing a biography, you're really working to get into somebody else's mind. And so no one person has the whole skill, except maybe Oprah. I don't know. But the skills of empathy, but mostly it's the skills of conversation and knowledge. And then finally, knowing what to look for in a person. Like, what are the important things you would want to know? And I do think, you don't ask this right away, but I do think, how were you loved and not loved? If you really want to know somebody, eventually you have to get to that question. Because the way we were loved is an important part of who we are, and how do you construct your own personal story? What story do you choose to tell in what circumstances? And culture, like I said, how the dead show up in your life, like this great book, Albion Seed, about how the different tribes from England came over and created entirely different cultures from Connecticut to West Virginia. And the power of these things over centuries is really very, very impressive. And most of us don't know ourselves that well. So we only discover who we are through this process of mutual revealing and mutual unveiling, which is why if you're sitting at a bar and some person starts talking to you, you begin this process of defining yourself by feeling each other out. Or verbally, I should say.
You sort of, yes, to be completely clear, yes. But so in order to see yourself, to some extent, you have to be seen by others. It's interesting because people have always, when I write about respect, people say, well, you have to have self-respect first in order to gain respect from others. But I've always wondered about the causality there, because it feels to me as if being respected by others is one of the ways you will acquire respect for yourself. You can't acquire respect for yourself as some completely sealed off individual and then go out into the world. And I guess it's the same here.
I think you have to see yourself loving and being loved before you can see yourself as lovable.
Yeah. Well, that's been a big theme of your work, I think, probably pretty much all along, which is this relational idea of personhood. So, and the motto of this podcast of Dialogues is that thinking together in relationship. And I think that idea of relationship is critical for intellectual development as well as moral and personal. So, well, that's been a great dialogue. And when's the book coming out? When can we expect this book? Can you say publicly, or will it get you into trouble with your publisher?
Yes, it's not for a long time. It's going to be May of 2024, I guess, or 2023, something like that. 2023, May of 2000. So it's not just around the corner.
Okay, well, if your publisher's listening, then I'm sure he'll hit that deadline. But it's been great to talk to you, David. Thank you so much.
Okay, it's been great to talk to you and to be in friendship with you for the last 5 or 6 years that we really got to know each other. So I really appreciate it.
Well, back at you, David. Thank you. Thanks for listening to Dialogues. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please take a moment to follow, like, rate, and share the podcast in all the usual places. And send me your thoughts and ideas, including for future guests, to dialoguespod@gmail.com. That's dialoguespod@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.